and welcome to this NLA webinar on equalising opportunity in public space, part of the NLA's Royal Docs programme. I'm Tom Holbrook. I'm a design advocate for the Mayor of London. I'm director of Fifth Studio, and we're leading the work to establish a public realm design framework across the Royal Docs. We're going to hear from 5 speakers on different aspects of the public realm around the question, how can the built environment sector contribute to a more democratised and inclusive public space? There will be time for Q&As at the end of the session, so please do post your questions through the Q&A button that you'll see here on Zoom. And I'm now going to introduce the first of a series of 5 speakers, Dan Bridge, Programme Director at the Royal Docs, who will be presenting the Royal Docs placemaking strategy. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Hi everyone, I'm Dan Bridge. I'm the Programme Director of the Royal Docs team. Just for those of you who don't know, the Royal Docs team is a joint initiative by the Mayor of London and the Mayor of Newham, which has the responsibility for overseeing the physical, economic and social regeneration of the Royal Docs and the surrounding land. Today, I'm going to spend the next few minutes explaining to you the Royal Docs team's view of public space here and the work that we've been doing to ensure that the opportunity that's created is maximised, and that we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're equalising opportunity of access to that public space. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I think the first thing to say is the Royal Docs is a fascinating post-industrial landscape, and it really is a story of fairly significant challenges, but also probably more significant opportunity. The landscape that is there today was very much influenced by the development of the docks in the mid-19th century, and the original design of this place was very much around keeping people out. As we've gone through the closure of the docks in the late 20th century, earlier ideas of regeneration were very much based about car-borne development. When our delivery plan was approved in 2018, a significant proportion of the £300 million that we secured for funding for the redevelopment of the Royal Docks was aimed at improving the public realm. So we worked and appointed Fifth Studio to produce a public realm framework for us. Next slide, please. So public realm framework was published in March of this year, and it very much establishes a vision for public realm in the Royal Docks. It very much is about developing a coherent design character for sites that we're directly responsible for, but also the sites of other partners that we work with in the area. It really is focusing on improving and greening the landscape. It's a very harsh industrial landscape still at the moment. It was very much about us trying to identify what were those sites that we wanted to focus on first and would have the greatest impact on the regeneration of the wider area. And it was about identifying priority networks. And really importantly here, I think for the subject of this debate, it was really about making sure that we were connecting in very large new development sites that have not had development on them for in some cases up to 30 years, with the existing surrounding communities, some of which have been fairly isolated for a while. So just to give you an overview, very quick overview of what that work entailed. So there's a huge amount of work that's been done over the Royal Docks over many years and with our development partners, and we weren't starting with a blank sheet. So it's very important that we created a baseline study and worked from what was already existing. It was really important that it supported the other work of the team and other significant bits of work that were underway in terms of making sure the public realm supports the economic purpose and cultural purpose of the place. It was about establishing some guiding principles for the work that we're doing, but also our partners. And it was about trying to work out which of those bits of the Royal Docks were lots of good work being done by our existing development partners, but where were the gaps where nobody was really thinking about how we knitted together some of these very large development sites. Next slide, please. I think all the way throughout this, I think inclusivity and accessibility has been very much at the forefront of our minds, and I think it's fair to say that you know, I suppose the majority of that focus is thinking has been thinking about physical accessibility, but clearly, given the events that have happened, you know, during COVID, post-COVID, and particularly the Black Lives Matters movement, I think our understanding of inclusivity and accessibility has broadened somewhat, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that in the discussion. But clearly, we've been informed by you know, a huge amount of other work that's been done at a Newham and a citywide level, which is all about pushing the boundaries and leading good practice on inclusivity and accessibility, and some of those documents and strategies are listed there. Next slide, please. I think one of the key things for us as a Royal Docs team, and very important to Roxana, the Mayor of Newham, is the way that we engage and involve communities in the development, not just only the strategy and plans for public realm, but then also the implementation and use of these sites. And so from the team's inception in December 18, we have undertaken numerous exercises to engage the existing local community and key stakeholders. Probably the most significant one of them was last year, when we coordinated a sort of a 4-month-long activity called the Royal Docs Conversation, which engaged with a significant number of local community groups and actually funded local communities to undertake their own engagement and investigation and make recommendations for how they wanted to influence all the work of the team, but with particular focus on public realm. And now that is being taken forward into the detailed design of individual sites, where we're engaging various community groups, various communities in the development of the detailed design briefs, and also engaging them in the implementation of works. Next slide, please. So four key principles that underpin our public realm framework. Activating the water is an absolutely critical one. There's a huge body of water in the Royal Docks. It's about 4 kilometres long. Most of it is not well used as it should be. It's really important that the public realm framework enables access to and around the water. The stitches and connections I referenced, you know, the real key thing that this needs to do is to link and integrate existing communities, some of which are fairly deprived, with the new communities, which are more mixed and diverse in nature. This is not about having a single approach across the whole area. It's about developing some sort of coherence, but it's accepting and understanding that in an area of this scale, that there's an importance in having diversity within that landscape, but in a way that you know, is coherent over the piece. And it's thinking about how the historic nature and heritage of this place has influenced the different landscape characters. Next stage, please. So a really key thing for us was really trying to make sure that we were investing in the most appropriate places, those places that would have most impact and benefit to existing communities, but also meet our key objectives of attracting new residential and non-commercial occupiers to this place. And so all of the baseline work that we did enabled us to identify which of those sites would have the most impact, and these are the ones that you see ahead of us today. Next slide, please. The public realm framework was the first part of this work, but we're now very deep in the Fifth Studio team, Royal Docs team, very deep in working with the community on developing a set of design guides, which influence sites that we're directly delivering ourselves, but also a range of different development partners. And importantly, they cover wayfinding, lighting and landscape, which I think, again, we can discuss about how important that is for making these places accessible and inclusive. But we are specifically also taking a different approach from cycling and walking and accessibility and inclusive design, so that at each stage, at the design stage and at the implementation stage, we're considering and evolving the design to ensure that they're accessible and inclusive. Next slide, please. So public realm design guides cover these 4 areas, and I think these are the things that we think are some of the most important things in ensuring that the new and improving landscape public realm is accessible and inclusive. And this is very much about really building on this idea of seeing the Royal Docs team as an enabler and an influencer rather than necessarily the delivery agent in each case. And so we're developing these in partnership with the community, our development partners and stakeholders, and they're very much accepting them. Next slide. And then finally, final slide from me is all of this is being developed in line with an accessibility advisor that is working alongside both my team and the consultant team at each and every stage to make sure that all aspects of accessibility are being considered, and we're delivering this in the most inclusive way. And I think that's the last slide, isn't it? Next slide. Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. So our next speaker is Maria Adewale-Shuade. She's Chief Executive of the Foundation for Future London. Maria, over to you.
Hi. It's really good to be on this and to be talking about inclusive placemaking. I don't think we do it often enough, actually. It's a big part of our work at the Foundation Future London, which is expanding opportunities and creating vibrant spaces within East Bank in a way that has authentic engagement with local people around places that they live and work in. And of course, Newham, Tower Hamlets and Waltham Forest are our neighbourhood partners. And so in a way, the work that we do is very much triangulated with the Royal Docs. And it's really interesting to see that very similar processes around inclusive public realm is also been taken on board as well within East Bank, and certainly the way that we as a foundation will grant funding. I guess if I go through some of the sort of wider views on equalising public space, it seems that the programme of work for us is about really meeting human needs. And if you think about some of the most basic things as humans that we need is a habitat, and one which we feel safe and secure in. And I think a chapeau for us is the SDG 11, that's about making cities inclusive and safe and resilient and sustainable. And placemaking has been used for some people as a kind of nice to have. It isn't, it's absolutely a must, it's a human right. And for us, the way that we underpin inclusive placemaking and making sure we equalise public space is working on a set of social value principles about what does it look like, what does a resilient place look like that provides equality, jobs, opportunities. And I think the first thing that we do is starting from a place of not thinking that we're the experts and not thinking that actually the communities we work with need our support. It's almost the other way around. They're the designers, they're the placemakers, they understand what makes a place resilient and equitable. And we need the kind of planning frameworks at a national level to make sure that happens. But as a grant-making foundation, we're looking to support participatory processes in placemaking. We're looking for that sweet spot between the environment, social inclusion and fair economics. So if you were to think about a broader way of equalising public space in our conversations with local communities and our partners, it's really about society, economy and environment. And really place is a bit of an open book, isn't it? It's about allowing or thinking with broader dimensions around engagement, emotional connections, empowerment and ownership. And I think what's happened sometimes is that we've allowed placemaking to be seen, as I said, as a must-have, and rather as something which is more important around a human right and a sharing of space and a sharing of an economy. But if we were to look at the kind of things we want to support and invest in, it's around where are those shared spaces, who's been involved in the collaborative design and decision making. We're looking for the economic thread that runs through that. What's the job security for local people? Where's the access to career and opportunities all the way along? Social entrepreneurship, how does placemaking and space design make sure that happens? How does this revitalize a neighborhood? As Tom said, also bringing people together, but recognizing the schisms and the problematic issues around the old and the new. And of course, if you're doing real inclusive placemaking, you have to think about protection of green spaces. I mean, now more than ever, but always understanding that we need to be climate resilient to that. And what does that mean for local communities? One of the things that we look for as well is something that I'm calling red pins, and it's kind of 6 activation points for what makes a good place. So relationships are built quite often in public spaces, and it's about creating those emotional ties. Sometimes we're a bit romantic. We think build something, make the design great, people will come to it and they will all enjoy equally. That doesn't always happen. So we're looking for what's the access, what's the equitable access to the environment? How have we designed this at public scale? And when we're talking about public realm, making sure it's not lost within that private ownership design, which sometimes happens. And when we're talking about inclusion, let's not just use it as one of those nice to have words. It's actually deeply political. What does this really mean? How do we really open up a space to everyone and not limit it to the few? And then crucially, making sure people feel safe. Now, we quite often think of this as tackling crime, the fear of crime, and that is important, absolutely. But actually making something safe is about feeling okay in a space. And there's some really interesting work that's been happening, research that's been happening called weathering. And it's about the impact of being the other in a public space. How do people get to enjoy it? It's really nice to have a green space next to you or a public realm. But if you feel you can't be there because there's no opportunities, you get stared at. These are the kind of things we've been told. You know, the kind of economic offers aren't there. If you have a low budget, actually you don't feel you can be in that space because nothing else has been provided for you. Where are the picnic tables? Those kind of things. So it's about breaking down some of those political barriers and going beyond design and looking at the politics behind spaces as well. Of course, as a foundation that's funding an arts and culture sector, we're also looking at the kind of nexus between public space and using it as a canvas for art and opportunities to meet and talk to each other. If I was personally to have something around inclusive, equitable spaces and equalising places, I would ask for anyone involved in public design and placemaking to have an Hippocratic oath. And I'm sure some of you will agree, it's about doing no harm, but it's about doing much more than that. It's about equality and it's about human rights, and recognising that when we talk about places, that we must invest in them in a way that everyone is involved, everyone gets to join it, enjoy it, and everyone gets economic and social value out of that.
Thank you, Maria. Fantastic. So the next speaker is David Ogunmoriwa, partner at Architecture Doing Place. David?
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. I'm an architect and also a mayor's design advocate. Also, I lecture at Portsmouth University School of Architecture. I think we're all, in a sense, going to be saying very similar things because public space is one of those things that everybody can buy into and agree broadly on what we're trying to provide and why it should be inclusive. But I'd just like to kind of maybe propose as an architect, as a designer, a few different paradigms with which to look at equity in public space through the lens of placemaking. And the first of those, if I could just have the next slide. First of those is through the lens of girls and young women. So there's been a lot of work done in this, particularly, I should say, by a practice called White Architecture, who are based both in Sweden and in London. and they've done some projects over the last few years where, based on research that shows that 80% of public realm users are boys from the age of 7 onwards, while girls feel 10 times more insecure in public spaces. Now, this has kind of specific kind of implications for architecture, both the public realm and the private realm, actually. Private realms then have to try and accommodate where girls will find themselves. Public space has to try and broaden its appeal to girls and also allow itself to be defined more by girls and through their lens. If we just go into the next one. Another lens, I feel like, have we just jumped to one? Sorry. Oh, no. Okay, I'll keep going. I was going to talk about this one third, but this is about public health resilience. So we're in the age of COVID. Obviously, we're all very focused on this current public health situation, but the previous one, and not that far away, was actually a public health issue around knife crime. And the reason it's a public health issue is that it is about safety. It is about both space, health, access to the kind of resilient infrastructures and the ways in which people are able to live their lives, and the opportunities that people get in their lives that can contribute to how we read and use public space. So interestingly, when young teenage boys are asked why they don't use public space, they're afraid of two things. One of them is knife crime, but the other one is actually how they're going to be perceived by groups of adults who tend to look at them in a specific way and make them feel kind of other and somehow, about to kind of get up to no good, for want of a better phrase. I'm not putting that very eloquently, but this kind of feeling of of the public space not belonging to them, that it's a kind of contested territory where they have to almost they have to explain why they're there, and it doesn't feel like it's their space. This is also a consequence of the kind of internal spaces and smaller internal spaces that mean that there is less space in the home. So kids are kind of put out onto the street. There are less spaces in youth clubs and places where theoretically people would go, so that there's a kind of a forced intensity and intensification of the use of public space in the way that it's not always able to bear. If we could go into the next one. I seem to have lost one of my slides, but I'll speak generally about it afterwards. This one is about well-being generally, but we in our practice try and look at things through the lens of a set of really quite pithy lenses developed by the New Economics Foundation in the early part of this century, called 5 Ways to Wellbeing. And very simply, those are to connect. It's a place to kind of talk and listen. To be active. It's a place to kind of engage in physical activity and to keep active. To take notice, to remember, to kind of see what's around you, to be part of your environment, to feel immersed in that. To keep learning, to embrace new experiences, to see opportunities and get those incidental moments of surprise. And to give your time in kind of activities, to have conversations, to give your presence. So all these things kind of contribute to a sense of well-being, contribute to other people's sense of well-being. This is a project, the slides we're showing here is a project that we're doing at the moment that's in planning in Bethnal Green in East London. It's on the edge of an estate. We do a lot of infill work. It's with our colleagues, Make Space and You and Me Architects, who are collaborators. But the housing infill that we provided on the site was really defined by the public spaces and the placemaking that we wanted to provide. So we wanted to provide these new broader connections between the streets and the canal. We wanted to make sure that we preserved direct access, visual access to Victoria Park across the canal. We wanted to make sure that we maintained a ball court that was there existing and provide new incidental play space and doorstep play, whilst also creating more shared surfaces that are kind of available for slow flows of traffic, open air activities, and that kind of prioritize pedestrians and play over prioritizing cars. Can I just move on to the next one? Great. This was going to be my final slide, but it's really about equitable partnership. So there's a really interesting it's come to the fore quite prominently in the last week after an article in The Guardian. There's a really interesting kind of consequence of public space. So in our practice, we talk about our shared built environment forms all of us inescapably. It's not anything we can do anything about. It's where we kind of learn to grow. It's where we make friends. It's where we meet partners. It's where we meet friends. So it forms all of us, and lots of writers, theorists, novelists like Jane Jacobs, Walter Benjamin, Italo Calvino, and lots of kind of novelists that people will be familiar with and fond of, have described in their various ways how basically this kind of built environment is who we are in many ways. So it has this kind of systemic impact. It has this kind of deeper reach, this kind of almost intravenous kind of unconscious reach into our lives. And it defines our lives in so many ways. So it's really important in terms of democracy and belonging, civic trust, safety, and a shared identity that we all have, as well as our kind of private and personal identities. But there's an interesting thing about most of our built environments, most of our shared places are actually designed by people from a very narrow monoculture, even if that is paid for from the public purse. And it's always been a constant kind of surprise that those things that affect us most are not allowed to kind of be defined by the people who it affects. And I think that's a kind of, it's a disenfranchisement. So we talk about it as a kind of, to talk about taking the vote away from lots of people would be unthinkable. Yet that is what we do. People aren't allowed to tell their own stories. They're not allowed to express their own stories in the places that they share with others. Therefore, it becomes a place that in which they feel tolerated. And nobody really wants to be tolerated. Everybody wants to be respected and valued and kind of have a kind of agency and an entitlement to that space. So that's the point I wanted to make there. The slide that's missing, and I'm not sure if we can find it there, but just in case we can't, was about child-centered play and children-centered play. And it was just about thinking about the various ways and lenses in which we can kind of, I'm just going to try and pull it up on my screen here, my local screen, so just forgive me for a moment. Just in the various ways in which we can talk about what child-centered play might mean and the benefits it gives us. So there's all sorts of issues about kind of independent mobility for young people and children. The basic kind of developmental benefits that we have, proximity to new experiences and different people and friends and meeting them, a rights-based approach, kind of understanding based on the UN Charter for Young People, supervision in a kind of passive and kind of forced way, so a kind of proximity where people can have a proximity from a kitchen window to a public space, but that you don't have to watch over kids all the time. So there's that element of safety, but you can see them. Gender, which I've just gone into, an element of risk. So risk is beneficial and developmental, but obviously there's a balance between kind of having an element of risk, but making sure that that risk is a manageable one. Crime and antisocial behavior, as I've spoken about, but also third places, which are places between kind of formalized environments or kind of really supervised environments like your home and your school, and kind of the place between those journeys. So you know that on the way to somewhere, you can have these incidental moments, these kind of beneficial developmental and incidental moments. I think I'm going to leave it there for now, but I'm sure we can cover up some further issues I wanted to talk about to do with art and public spaces in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Fantastic. So next up, Bridget Snaith, who is Senior Lecturer at Landscape Architecture on the Royal Docks at the University of East London. Bridget, over to you.
Yeah, I've just unmuted myself. Good. Hello, yes, I'm Bridget Snaith, and as well as being a lecturer in landscape architecture at the University of East London, I'm also a partner in the practice Shape. Could we go to the first slide, please? So this is one of our projects with Shape, which was actually an NLA award winner for public realm design, which is Van Gogh Walk in Stockwell. And I'm going to talk very briefly about that project at the end of this presentation, because I believe it illustrates some of the work that we can do as practitioners in trying to broaden access to valuable quality open space and interactive public realm right where people are living. Next slide, please. So the background picture for this slide is drawn from my work on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, where I was looking at exactly the issue that was raised there about the whiteness of the landscape profession compared to the population for whom they are designing, where I looked at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and asked whose values and whose benefits were being explored in that space. So in my professional work, I also work on equalities impact assessments, and it's great that the topics of lack of access, equality of access to open space on grounds of age, not just older people who feel frightened to be in public space very often, but young people who feel excluded by suspicion in many cases, means that people don't have equal access on grounds of age to public space. And also we spoke briefly there, or David was covering issues of gender and access to public space. And I think the point's already been made that equality is not really about treating everyone the same way. It's actually about recognizing and respecting the difference and diversity of people's experience, of people's needs, enough to adapt our practices and to not try to force what we consider to be the best or the most moral ways to behave in public space, or the true ways to exist on others. Next slide, please. So a lot of my research as a landscape architect has been based in trying to understand where the cultural imagery that informs landscape architecture in the UK has come from. And it's certainly the case that through development of cultural history, the overwhelming legitimate taste in landscape design in the UK for the white dominated industry that we are is of a romantic nature, that people should wish to aspire to escape the city, that they should want to be alone in nature, and that this should be somehow separate from our urban existence. These images, which are on this slide because they're illustrating how nature is good for us, are reinforced through the media, through education, through awards processes. As I've said, this kind of naturalistic environment is seen as more moral, more politically free, and healthful for everyone. But taste for this particular landscape type is definitely learned, and it's not innate. It's not intrinsically better, and it is full of inconsistency. So while Maria was talking about where people feel safe, not everyone feels exactly the same about spaces that appear to be not maintained. While many white people can look at large fields or areas of what might seem like wildflowers to us, those can feel like weeds to many people. And I think that these voices, these opinions are very often suppressed by landscape professionals who feel that they know best and that they should just educate these others to this point of view. So next slide, please. Our practice work is about really trying to listen to the people who we design for. We work with the communities in central London, where we've been practicing now for 20 years. Prior to coming to London, I was working in North Wales. And one of the first experiences that I had of working with diverse communities drew very strongly to my attention the sort of romanticization of wildflowers and of that kind of landscape type that I had very strongly been taught through my professional development. And I was showing pictures of what the landscape might be like to a community where we were hoping to do some improvements for them with a small amount of funding. And this lady of African origin said to me, "Oh gosh, that is awful. I wouldn't want anything that looked like that." I was thinking, well, I could understand her saying I wouldn't really like it, but saying it's awful, you know. And this is actually something which we have encountered. And as I started to look into research, it became apparent that actually it's pretty well known within the profession that there are diverse ranges of views, and that loose planting style, the romantic planting style, is not one that has universal appeal. So as we consider that the end user, the people who live in a place, are our ultimate client, it's really important that we hear what they're saying, and that we as designers seek empathy, that we are trying to understand why they would say that, and that we're not seeking to try to educate them out of that position. It may be that through education, people's tastes can be changed, and there are practitioners who speak about this as a reason to not worry about people's current tastes and preferences. However, people may not be motivated to do that. And in actually not listening, we create obstacles to people's use of public space. Next slide, please. So developing the research that I carried out at the Olympic Park, I've been able to formulate a kind of way of understanding how it is that people make decisions to use or not use public space. And you may or may not be aware that there is substantial evidence, including a longitudinal study by English Nature, that people who are from Black and Asian and minority ethnicities are less frequent users of public space in the UK, over, well, far more so than income related, and that this is supported by other research. What I found is that people's use of public space is rational, and it's based on whether the visit to the public space is going to be viable, whether they think it will bring them health benefits, whether it's healthful for them to do that, and whether in fact the space is interesting to them, meets with what they're interested to do there. Next slide, please. In terms of viability, I'm sure that many of us are familiar with the All London Green Grid and maps which show deprivation in access to open space. And what CABE found in 2010 is that in areas where 40% of people or more are from what are termed Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, there is 11 times less green space when this is compared to areas where the majority of residents are white. Now, going back to the English Nature study, their analysis has been that the reason that there's underrepresentation in open space of people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnicities is a lack of engagement with nature, and that people need to be brought to nature in order to understand it better. And this is exactly the kind of education I'm talking about. But I was quite horrified when just under a year ago, I found out that they don't actually factor in this finding about the availability of green space in the locality in that study. So actually their figures may be giving them completely the wrong idea. Next slide, please. This is a summary where we were looking at interests of people in using public space or park spaces in Croydon. We were doing some initial survey work, and while we didn't measure ethnicity, unfortunately, we weren't able to capture that in the way that we would have liked. We did manage to capture what could broadly be called racial groupings, which is really not the perfect, but it was what we had. And the findings from that study were quite interesting. If you look at the diagram, top left, The averages for people who claimed a Black ethnicity in discussing why they wished to go to Croydon's Park, they prioritised children's play, exercise, fresh air was there, and then other elements like walking or wildlife were relatively less often claimed. The top reason for people claiming Asian ethnicities was for children's play, and this was an overwhelming difference from the other findings. And when we came to white people, there was a very strong balance between walking and walking the dog. And this survey was done in response to some findings that had been predecessors to our study, where the council were working on the basis that walking and walking the dog was the main activity in Croydon's parks for everyone. But what had happened was that they'd had a huge overrepresentation of a particular set of people in responding to that survey who was skewing the results. And by actually being able to disaggregate some of the information, we were able to show that this isn't necessarily a universal. People have different ideas about what's right to do in public space. People have different ideas about what are good reasons to not be working, to be giving themselves over to leisure time. People are publicly performing their identity to each other in public space. They're trying to sort of express shared values, as well as doing things which bring relaxation that they believe are helpful to them. And what's possible is always constrained by what activity is available, what facilities there are. As Maria was saying, if you don't have picnic tables, it's really hard to eat outside. If you don't have dog-free areas, it's really hard if you can't mix with dogs. And all of these things need to be considered to allow people that freedom to publicly perform their own identity. What has to be borne in mind is, of course, these are group averages. These are not individual measures, but one of the things that did come out from this study that we carried out was that the interest in wildlife is a consistent element across the groups. However, unlike English nature, we're not actually seeking to try to embed this in communities. What we're trying to advocate for is to listen to people, to try to understand why they're saying what they're saying, and to think about how you can facilitate their presence in public space. Next slide, please. I'm just going to need to be really quick because I'm really overrunning. So this is a slide of a mini Holland scheme, and it just shows the opportunity to address some of those viability issues that we have throughout our public realm. Next slide, please. This is Isabel Street, which then became Van Gogh Walk. Next slide, please. It's a route to school, but we've managed to stop the flow of traffic at one end. We've included a basketball hoop in the street and a football goal. Next slide, please. And this is this space last November. People are still using it. It's on the way to school. There are places to sit. There's gardening. There's book collection points. Next slide, please. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bridget. And then for our final speaker, last but not least, I'd like to bring in Farmida Rahman, who is a researcher and policy analyst at the Resolution Foundation. Farmida.
Yeah, so in my day job, I am one of the economists at the Resolution Foundation, but over the past 6 months, I've sat on the Newham's Democracy Commission, which is what I'm going to talk to you a bit about today, and some of the recommendations are sort of coming out of that. So the commission was established by the Mayor and Council of Newham in autumn of 2019, and it was given 2 main tasks. And the first was to examine the council's current directly elected mayor system of governance and alternative types that exist in local government, and to make recommendations on the best system for Newham's future. But the second was to explore ways in which local residents will have opportunities to be more engaged and involved in local decision making and the council's work. And the second bit is what I'll be talking a bit more about now. So Newham faces a somewhat unique challenge in terms of democracy and inclusion in the borough. So even in the most basic sense, democratic engagement is low. while turnout at around 36% in the 2018 local elections is similar to other London boroughs, voter registration at around 59% is lower than all other boroughs and is about 15 percentage points lower than the borough with the highest voter registration, which is Havering. And this means that even though turnout is similar, in practice, the overall percentage of the population that is likely to vote is much lower. Of course, turnout isn't the best indicator of democratic participation, as voting is just a web of means through which people may engage with local government, but it's currently the most tangible data that we have, and people engage with other forms of democracy much less than they do with voting. So it gives us a bit of an indication of the problem. And there are a number of reasons for low democratic engagement, a number of potentially reasons. But in Newham, a very likely reason is to do with the makeup of the borough. So as has already been mentioned, Newham is one of the poorest neighbourhoods, not only in London, but in the UK. And people from poorer households are much less likely to vote en masse and much less likely to engage in democratic processes. But Newham also has an unusually young population. And again, young people are much less likely to engage in democratic processes. And then there's another process going on whereby it has quite a transient population, so people come and go much faster than they do in other places, so actual connection to the borough is a bit lower. But the challenge with this, and particularly with the fact that Newham is one of the poorest neighbourhoods, is that those people, so people with less sort of financial resources, are those that are likely to need the most engagement with council resources and local resources. So in many respects, these are the groups that should be engaging most in local democracy and democratic processes. But within that, there are a number of sub-challenges in terms of sort of how we go about engaging these groups. Time being a key one, I think, particularly when we're talking about low-income households, the time to sort of engage with democracy meaningfully, even to sort of go out and vote, can be quite limited. But also there's a likely lack of trust in the system or potential feelings of powerless within systems that do exist. So as an example, in some of our evidence sessions, local residents cited only being engaged in consultations once decisions had already largely been passed, which essentially undermines any involvement on their part that had sort of happened. So I think where people have been engaged in the democratic process, there's a sense of powerlessness within that and a sense of sort of being overlooked, or that their engagement isn't meaningful. So the starting point for our recommendations within the new mayoral model that was proposed is rooted in a philosophy of really redirecting power back to residents. And there are a number of ways we can do that, much of which involve novel uses of data and technology. So the first major strand is through democratizing data, and we achieve this via the creation of what we call an Office for Data Discovery and Democracy, O3D in short. I think knowledge production is a key part of the policy-making process, and if we are to think about involvement in democratic processes, so democratizing data is really about opening up the data that the council holds, enabling us to take advantage of collective intelligence to better understand how the council and its partners can support local people. So effective knowledge production and dissemination is really a key pillar of co-production, which sort of means working with local residents to sort of develop policy, to develop spaces for their use. And I think we need to do that in a meaningful way if we're to actually empower residents in decision-making process and knowledge creation, but also knowledge sort of dissemination is a key part of that. And we do that through this idea of democratizing data through digital means. The second sort of looks at bringing people more into the democratic process via technology or digital platforms. So over the past decade, governments and governments and local governments been experimenting with deliberative democracy, so which is facilitated in large part by digital platforms. So a major example is V Taiwan, the V-Taiwan process is designed to provide a neutral platform in which diverse opinion groups can come together to build consensus. And this grew out of a need for greater transparency in the democratic process in Taiwan around the 2010s. NUM itself has already used the Polis platform, which facilitates V-Taiwan to involve and engage local people in the past on decisions around parking restrictions in the local area. Of course, there are valid concerns about digital inclusion, and we don't promote shifting processes entirely online, more that online processes are used in tandem with more traditional forms of engagement to facilitate deliberative democracy. And those are just a couple of the ways in which we propose using data infrastructures and digital platforms to enable democratic participation. And I think there are big opportunities within this for decision making with regard to how public spaces are used. And I think it links to a lot of what Daniel spoke about earlier in terms of sort of engaging people in the planning process. I think these digital platforms and these ways of engaging with people, particularly at early stages of the process, and meaningfully engaging with local people in planning processes, can really be facilitated through these means of digital inclusion and through processes of deliberative democracy. But I think a lot of issues have sort of been raised about meaningful engagement, and I think relying on just digital platforms and these initiatives are only take us part of the way. And I think the key question that we've got to grapple with in taking this forward and taking these recommendations forward is that we can sort of implement them, but to what extent are we implementing those and sort of meaningfully and respectfully engaging with citizens? I think a tendency in a lot of decision making is and has been, not only in NUM, I think it would be unfair to say that it's a NUM specific problem. I think in wider policy processes and in disengagement in total, and we've seen this in terms of the outcome of the Brexit referendum, we've seen this in terms of people shifts in political voting behaviour and various other things, and disenfranchisement in political processes more broadly, is that how well do political parties and how well do political sort of figures engage with people and do that meaningfully. And I think deliberative democracy and digital platforms are just one of the ways of facilitating that, but a really powerful one at that, if we want to sort of involve people and reach people that we don't normally reach, particularly those younger populations and those transient populations that are sort of moving in and out of the borough. The other question that I was sort of asked to address as part of this is what I, as a resident of Newham, want the future of the Royal Docks to look like. I think that's an interesting question. I actually live in the Royal Docks ward and sort of in one of the nicer areas of Royal Docks, sort of looking out over the water. And I think what's already been said is quite enlightening in terms of how we think about the space and how we think about using the space. I think a lot of what was spoken about when I was on the commission and when we were engaging with the public is not only sort of meaningful engagement with the public, but actually sort of how spaces are used and how development in the local area really involves people that have lived there for a long time and the sort of long-standing communities. And I think a development like the Royal Docks in many ways does sort of risk that sense of alienation. But it also provides lots of opportunities. I think it's a free public space in an area where we are in many ways quite surrounded by motorways and pollution and quite poor air quality. So I think it's quite an important space in that respect, and one which the usage of which should be democratized. And I think not only do we need to involve local people, we need to think about how we can create a space here. And I think that is already being done to a great extent of sort of creating a space that's useful for people, but also useful for people's health and well-being. And I think a space that facilitates sort of engagement of local communities, local business, and bringing sort of local residents into the area in a way that facilitates wealth building and facilitates sort of people building their livelihoods in this area. I think that's a challenge that sort of Newham as a whole faces. So yeah, that's sort of, those are my sort of 2 cents, both on sort of democratizing the sort of planning process and sort of how the future of the Royal Docks, really.
Okay, thank you, Farmida. That's a really useful place to end. And I'm conscious we're short of time, so we're going to skip the panel discussion and go straight to audience questions. We've had an incredibly sort of diverse range of inputs on the sorts of things we need to be thinking about. I think this one really sort of chimes with me in terms of the way that we've all used our public spaces differently during lockdown, and thinking about how we use public space and our fitness and health and so on, which a number of you have talked about. But Andrew Morris has asked, is public space one of the last remaining opportunities to offer equitable freedom within our increasingly privatized built environment, given recent events? Will we start to see a shift in attitude where the value of public space is deemed an asset and of greater benefit than the operational and management risks that sometimes prohibit inclusivity? Which of the panel would like to pick that up? Or perhaps we could have a very quick discussion about that.
If I may, I might just jump in really quickly there and suggest that something about the premise of the question, because I actually don't think, I want to get away from the idea of it being the last. I think there has always been a kind of constant tension between space, available space, and who uses it and who gets to use it. And whilst I think there is a kind of trend towards privatization, I don't think that's a new trend. I think that's been going on for, frankly, 30 years. I went to school in Bermondsey, further down the road, in the Docklands area, and that was during the period of the LDDC, when a lot of the Docklands and the Royal Docks and the Isle of Dogs were actually privatised. A lot of it is now being reclaimed, I think, publicly. I think there is an issue about, that's the same issue about kind of scarcity of land, frankly, and I think the way that we hack that is by claiming it in a kind of civic way. And I think what I welcome about the question is the intention to kind of lay claim to public space and demand that it's ours, if I can put it like that.
Very nice, thank you, David.
I could come in on that. Oh, sorry, no, Maria, do you want to go?
You're muted, Maria.
Right, okay. Yeah, thanks. I totally agree with David. I think this is something about reclaiming it and not asking for permission. But as I said before, I think place is political, and we do need planning laws, and we do need investment in planning in a way that actually recognises and supports the need for people to be involved in the decision making. And so currently, when we're dealing with resilience and C19 and tight budgets, we have to be very careful that we hang on to the very minimum or maximum of what we've got of current planning laws and regulation. I think it was Catapult that put out a report recently, and it was a need to actually provide financial support to communities to be involved in the planning process. Because, as one of our colleagues, Hamid, has already said, it's actually very difficult as a member of the community to be part of that. The time, understanding it, all the other things that you've got to do if you've got 2 or 3 jobs already and then you've been asked to be involved in the planning process. So I think you're right, David, let's claim it, but let's not lose sight of the need for legislation and an overall citizenship conversation about planning and who gets to make those decisions, so that it does stay public and not only private.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think the promise of public space is that it is democratic, but we know that we have a flawed democracy, and so it's not as open as we would wish, and it's also really badly resourced in terms of the maintenance, which has been one of the key reasons why these unkempt meadows have become so fashionable is because they promise all the good of green infrastructure with none of the maintenance responsibility. And I think we really need to kind of get a sense of bringing forward community infrastructure levy that actually incorporates maintenance for those very much needed public spaces, and might even include things like facilitators, play leaders, community gardeners, park keepers, you know, all those people that used to be in public spaces that could help to keep them civil and who could also get to know the teenagers. So I think we, you know, we might romanticize our public space. We also should recognize that privatized spaces often have higher levels of security, which can bar some people, but also facilitates use by some people who are actually quite scared in the more public spaces. And there are studies around how families in Liverpool, even poor families in Liverpool, were going to Liverpool One for a day out and taking picnics because it was safer than going to Victoria Park. So, I mean, you know, there are some real problems in public space, which I think we need to think deeply about rather than saying, oh, we can solve this with a low maintenance solution.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we learned in the Royals quite early on was that young people like to use Excel because it's a safe space. It's really well, you know, the security is good and it's a safe place for young people to hang out. I've got another question here, which I'm guessing is for Dan, but follows on very nicely from some of the things that were just said on access and inclusivity. What's your view on the arbitrary closure of public access to the waterfront? We had a shocking situation recently where a landowner locked their gates to a vast area of Royal Albert Dock with knock-on effects of cycling and other exercise. And I guess this is the kind of ongoing, we're very aware of this in the Royals, that in terms of the trust of you being able to continue your circular walk, often with building work, think bits are closed off and you have to double back. Dan, is that something you could
so yes, so I think, I mean, it follows on, you're right, it follows on from the previous question in many ways. In the Royal Docks is this fascinating example from an ownership point of view, because although the GLA is the freeholder to you know, the majority of the estate and the land around it, the way that the estate's been developed over the last 30 years means that long leasehold interests have been given to various private sector landowners without really any overarching plan for how that space is designed, managed and maintained. And I guess very much the thrust of the work that I was talking about earlier in terms of trying to have a coherent approach, not only to the design of the of that public realm, but also to the management of that public realm, is absolutely critical to the success of the place. I think the example that you've just given there, it was an issue, is an issue about how, you know, how we had to intervene to get the gates open at Royal Albert Dock. I think a part of it was specifically related to the use of the Nightingale Hospital on the Excel estate. So there was very good reasons for why a significant part of it was closed, and that wouldn't happen under normal circumstances. But absolutely the work of the public realm framework, and actually the way that it's brought together a whole range of stakeholders to consider, you know, the nature of this type of space, what it's used for, and then therefore what flows out of that from a management and a maintenance point of view, is a really important bit.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in on that? There's a really useful question here. By the way, Joe East asks, wayfinding, why don't you just go for legible London signs as found across the east of London?
I can answer that. So we have used Legible London signs. So we're a member of Legible London, and that was one of the first things that we did actually, was put Legible London in. I think when we're talking about wayfinding, we're talking about it much more broadly than just a signage approach. So you know, as you probably will know, you know, really thinking about you know, the whole range of the whole gambit of design, and thinking about where people are and how they get to places is way beyond signage. So yeah, signage, Legible London, great. We're on that, and we've started to implement that already, but we're talking about it much more broadly.
Fantastic. We're going to have to wrap up, but I think there's a really useful final question here, which is, could the panelists recommend any books or resources that they've found useful when looking at inclusive placemaking and resilient infrastructure, particularly in relation to viewing communities as the designers and experts in their own individual environments.
I have two on my desk right next to me.
Go ahead, Maria.
So one is called Our City. It was written by the European Placemaking Group, and actually you can get it for free on PDF now. And it's about countering exclusion in public spaces, and it picks up on a lot of the comments that we've all made, but with a kind of European view to it as well. So this I think is really good. Lots of different case stories, so you don't have to read the whole thing. And then I can give you a copy of this one for free, which is just some research that I did around placemaking and using philanthropy to disrupt the way that we look at environment and social placemaking. It's called the Placemaking Factor.
What's the title of that last one?
It's the Placemaking Factor, Disrupting Environmental and Social Grant Making. It was about looking at how we use philanthropy and other people to invest in some of our work.
Great, thank you, Maria. Has anyone got any top reads?
If you were looking for some other people's resources and support for the things I was saying, you could look up Community Green, which was published by CABE in 2010. CABE Space, I should say. Dear departed.
Yeah.
Well, Design Council now.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. There's a huge amount of questions now coming in, but I'm afraid it's too late. So we're going to have to leave it there and pick up some other threads of this perhaps at another time. But thank you so much to all the panelists. This was really, really useful to me to listen to, and some great questions from the audience too. It's a shame we can't see you in front of us. And thanks very much to the NLA for this event. I think that's it. Bye-bye.